Hey, it's Kristin Donnelly, co-host of Everything Cookbooks. If Write a Cookbook tops your list of goals for 2023, I want to help you tackle it. On January 9th, I'm starting a new course called the Cookbook Proposal Bootcamp. Over 8 weeks, we'll take your cookbook proposal from draft to done. You can learn more about the course and see if it's right for you at proposal.kristindonnelly.com. Use the code EverythingCookbooks, all one word, at checkout to receive $50 off the course.
Happy New Year! Welcome to Everything Cookbooks, the podcast for writers, readers, and cooks. I'm Molly Stevens, and I'm joined today by Andrea Nguyen, Kate Leahy, and Kristin Donnelly for a special New Year's episode of Everything Cookbooks. Hey, everyone.
Hey, Molly. Happy New Year.
Hey, Molly.
Happy New Year.
So I think one thing I know we all agree upon about this podcast is how much we enjoy hearing from the growing community of listeners. So I thought maybe we'd start today's episode with some questions that folks have sent in. Kate, you want to start us off?
Yeah, absolutely. I love these questions because I always end up thinking of, I hadn't thought of that, but now I have more questions. So keep the questions coming. So this first one comes from a friend of the show, Isabella. Hi, Kate, Kristin, Molly, and Andrea. What is the etiquette around asking for a recipe? I've seen recipe head notes explaining that the author went traveling or ate something yummy and then asked the restaurant for the recipe, of course, crediting the chef or the restaurant. I have always thought that was kind of rude because recipes are the restaurant's livelihood and people could potentially copy them and sell them as their own. But now I'm thinking, maybe it's not so bad? Great question. What do you guys think?
It's up to the restaurant, of course, but a lot of that can be exposure for them. So many restaurants are very happy to share their recipes. And I think that they don't think too much about the copying or they're, like a restaurant's so much more than just the food. It's the experience.
I feel like this is something that's changed a lot over the past few decades that, 30 years ago, it was like, secret recipe and you would never know. The chef would guard their secrets. And I just feel that it's much more open now and it's not so proprietary. I don't know. Andrea, what's your thought?
Well, when I've traveled abroad and asked people for recipes, I approach it very, very carefully because people think, oh my God, she's going to steal my ideas. I mean, Vietnamese people, who are my normal targets for recipes, they tend to be skeptical and they think, oh, who is this woman? And so I have to be very careful. Oftentimes, if necessary, I will have a fixer introduce me as a cookbook author. I provide a business card with my website, my contact information. And then I also just tell these people, look, I am an American. I'm writing for an audience in America. They want to know your story. Can you help me tell your story through your recipe? And I will credit you. I will, send you a copy of the book when it comes out, blah, blah, blah. Or the article if I'm writing a story, reporting a story for a magazine or newspaper or something like that. Just so that they have a sense that, there is an exchange of some sort. Mm-hmm. So that you're just not taking from them.
Right.
For sure.
And I'm very, very careful and very respectful of people. Now, if the person just randomly approaches me and says, hey, I'll teach you something because we randomly meet on the street or in a plane or something like that, on a plane, which has happened to me before, they may just give me a tip or something. And then it depends on how much of their information I use that I will circle back to them and, credit them and stuff like that. But, you got to be respectful of people's knowledge.
Oh, yeah. I feel like it should always be a mutually beneficial exchange. People say no. Some people don't want to share. Yep. So, and I think that's fine.
Well, I think there's something to be said for a recipe that you might put in a book or an article is going to probably be dramatically different from whatever you learned from a restaurant or from a home cook. When I worked on the book Lavash, we traveled around Armenia and went into home kitchens and learned from the cooks there. But I can say with complete certainty, I never received a printed out recipe from somebody to say, here's my recipe. You're in someone's kitchen, you're watching how they're cooking, and you're making notes about, okay, that's something they're doing here, but we have different ingredients, so I'm going to have to adjust that back home. I'll have to see if I can replicate that texture. I'm going to remember what that texture looks like, take a picture, ask them about what they're going for. But then I'm going to have to create a recipe that works in the U.S. and meets the flavors I remember, but also works with the U.S. ingredients. So at that point, the story of the origin story is very important for the head note, but the actual recipe is something that I have created. It's intellectual property unique to the book. So there's that balance too, that you want to credit people for giving you great ideas, or if it is a specific recipe that you are using, then yes. But oftentimes I find I don't think in any book used a recipe from an outside source that's exactly written that way. It hasn't worked that way. So I think if I got a restaurant recipe, and I know I've done restaurant books, and Kristin, you know this, when you get a restaurant recipe and you have to translate it for a cookbook, and maybe you're working on that restaurant's book, you have to change a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's so true. Yeah. You have to adapt. Sometimes like it's the equipment, like hotel pan. I was just thinking about that. I remember the chef had written recipes that used hotel pans, and I was like, ooh. So there's a lot of adaptation that happens.
Yeah, I mean, in that J.J. Good episode we did, he talks a lot about translating chefs' recipes for cookbooks. Yeah, so I think if it's done well, it could also, honor the recipe, the chef, and bring some awareness to their cooking by, featuring it in a book. So I think if it's done well, it's a great idea.
Now, speaking of testing, you guys, there's another question that, boy, I think there's some bite to this one, too. Are all the recipes in cookbooks tested? There have been recipes from cookbooks that didn't work the first time and the second time. Usually I give up after that. I know there are variables like altitude and different ovens, and I use gram measurements, so I avoid recipes that use cups in general. What else should I consider in order to maybe have a successful third go?
Ooh. I don't know if I would have a third go if I tried it twice and it didn't work.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
At the beginning of this question, are all the recipes in all cookbooks tested?
Mine are.
Mine are.
Yeah, mine are too.
But all cookbooks?
No.
No, not all cookbooks.
No, I don't think they are.
We've all come across cookbooks that the recipes don't necessarily work.
I don't think that it's an issue of grams versus, imperial, metric versus imperial. I don't think that that's going to save you. What saves you is good instruction and ingredient lines that make sense. Look, we've been around this for a long time, these recipe writing and stuff. And you can look at a book and you can look at a recipe and just from the ratio of ingredients, have a sense whether or not it'll work. But I think that for a lot of people, they're like, there's like 100 recipes in here, and I'm just going to focus on the ones that I think are going to be recipes that people make. And they'll test that to death. But I don't know,
I did overhear a cookbook author once say something like, oh, yeah, my recipes I don't make every single one of them. Like, that's a lot of work.
Well, who does? Somebody does, right?
No, because I think some of them were sourced from like a restaurant. That happens a lot, I think, like not restaurant books, but when there are these compilation books and you're sourcing from a lot of different places, I think sometimes those are not fully tested.
Well, another thing, too, that could be happening in this case is if there's imperial and gram measurements, I wonder if the author, do they prefer imperial and then the publisher put on the gram measurements, or was it vice versa? So if the recipes aren't working and you happen to, be able to stomach cups and teaspoons and things, it might work doing it that way, because sometimes, believe it or not, the author will write all the recipes in imperial and a publisher will have a style that says, oh, no, we have to have grams on this. Here is our sheet. And it's like, okay, this 135 grams of AP flour is 1 cup. But what if your measurement was 125 grams AP flour for a cup?
They're doing the conversions post testing. And so they're not actually converting. They're just using a conversion chart. This question makes me so crazy, though, because I just think of what I'm hearing from this listener is they feel failure as a cook because they've cooked something and they think they've done something wrong. And that drives me nuts, because chances are, it sounds like this is a very careful cook. They followed the recipe carefully and it's not working. So to end the question, what else should I, if they want to give it a third try, maybe it's a dish that it really appeals. I would say go off script and take what you like from that recipe and try to make it your own, because continuing to follow it, I don't think it's a user error.
Well, I would add to that, in the age of social media, that and it sounds like a baking situation in particular, if the listener is asking about altitude and different ovens and stuff like that, I would just reach out to the book author and ask a few questions, especially you're like gone 2 rounds with a recipe that you would expect, the
That's
author
a great
to know
idea.
well. And just say, look, I tried all these things And I fielded questions from people. And they're like, I did this to a T and it didn't work. And then, we work through it together. And then they go, oh, well, I didn't do that. Yep. Or, I used a different flour and blah, blah, blah. So from an author's perspective, there are things that happen when you write a recipe. You're using certain kinds of ingredients. Let's say you use, to Kate's point, gold medal flour versus King Arthur. Totally two different flours in terms of, all-purpose, protein levels. That makes a difference. Mm-hmm. Let's say you're using organic granulated sugar versus regular granulated sugar. If you don't have a weight, that makes a difference. And it's not just, metric versus imperial. The other thing, too, is that things happen during bookmaking.
Exactly.
During the editing and design phase.
Things can get lost.
Errors are introduced. We try to catch them as best we can before the darn thing goes to print. But some things just happen.
Yep.
So I also want to say, give authors a little slack as well. Cut them a little slack. Because you think about the price of books and the price of going out to a meal these days at a restaurant, people are much more, I feel, forgiving a restaurant dish than they are of like a dish from a cookbook that they may have paid the same price for.
But I love this idea of reaching out, sending a DM or something to an author. But it could be, I saw this recipe in your book. It sounds so wonderful. I really want to make it. I've tried it. Am I missing something? That could be a nice open conversation. And maybe there are also food forums. I'm thinking, Food 52 comes to mind, but, community-based websites where people who love cookbooks talk about cookbooks. And maybe there's a group there that could crowdsource the answer. Or maybe you need to find a different cookbook and move on too. There might be that too.
I was going to say, I feel like it's probably a matter of finding who the author that resonates with you. Mm-hmm. If they have a lot of books, get all their books or, see who they like.
That's such a good point too, Kristin, because sometimes even though if the recipes, we gravitate to authors whose voice we respond to, that's who we're going to learn from as cooks, right? So if you're cooking from someone who writes in a style that doesn't really translate to how you cook, it just might not work as well. But if you find someone, I know, when I pick up my favorite authors, it's just I'm just going to have a nice time in the kitchen and a delicious meal because I feel like they're right there with me.
I don't know who this question is from, but we have it. I've been listening to your podcast and I love it. Thank you. I'm a food photographer and I'm currently writing, styling, and photographing and making a cookbook. I was wondering if you think self-publishing is the way to go, or would you recommend going to a publishing house with my book? I feel like this brings up the Sally Eckes answer to every publishing related question, which is
exactly.
It depends.
It depends. It's the $1 million question.
Yeah. So let's chew this over a little bit.
Well, first of all, congratulations for doing so much work.
Totally.
Regardless of what happens to your journey, being able to write, style, photograph, and actually make a book is a huge achievement. So you're learning all these skill sets, and it's probably really hard because some skill sets you're maybe more naturally inclined to than other skill sets. But regardless, you're just building all this knowledge by going through the process. So to the question on self-publishing versus publishing house, well, this is, I think, the meat of the matter. What are you guys thinking?
I self-published a number of years ago, Unforgettable, the book project about Paula Wolfert. We had a friggin' ball making that book. I got to tell you, writing, food photography, design, styling. It was a really magical process. It was really hard, and it made a beautiful book, an award-winning book. But I have to tell you all that if you want to get your book into the hands of a lot of people, it boils down to distribution. So that's the one thing that publishers have over, individuals is the ability to really get your work out there to a heck of a lot of people. Now, that was a long time ago that we published Unforgettable. The landscape has changed. So digital publishing, for example, like what Amazon does and some of the other outlets, allows, a lot of different voices to be heard, but there's no shame in self-publishing. People should go for it. If they want someone else to absorb the costs of putting a book together, then try with a regular publisher. But, they don't hold all the cards and they don't hold all the answers for you too.
Yeah. Self-publishing, to do it well, you're spending a lot of your own money. Thankfully, this is a food photographer. Food photography is often the most expensive thing. So that's just somebody's time, not just, but you're not spending money. But still, again, to do it well, you're going to want an editor, perhaps a designer. And then just all the printing. I mean, yeah, the printing costs and figuring out distribution. The other thing is when getting your book published by somebody else, you don't even necessarily need to have the whole book done. You could put together a proposal. I'm not going to say that that is less work. It's just different. But it can be less work in that you maybe only need to have 10 recipes done.
I would think about your intended audience for the book too. I mean, Andrea, you mentioned distribution, and I do think it's important to understand that distribution used to be the biggest restriction of self-publishing. It was just so hard to get books out there, but that is changing, and I think will continue to be. There are more avenues for self-published books and more interest by the public in self-published books. But for this listener, what's the audience? How big, would creating the book be an end goal, just having made this book? Or does it need to be in a lot of people's hands, and sort of try to figure out what the real goal target audience is? And I think that might help. Possibly, I mean, if you're considering going with a publishing house, then it's going to be trying to find an agent who wants the book, because that's going to make a big difference, I think, in terms of selling it, if you're able to find someone to work with.
Right. One thing I would add on to that is if you want to go the self-published route, I would highly recommend that you build up an email newsletter list, because I think that is more crucial. It's crucial in all types of publishing. And I know, Andrea and Kristin, you have great newsletters, something that is on my to-do list one of these fine years. But with self-publishing, I think it's incredibly important to have, because you need to create that demand, and you need to make yourself irresistible, and you need to make sure that your fans can find you and know who you are, and you connect with them. So if you already have an email newsletter, you can even tease it out to see how interested they would be in your book. Because if you can sell 3,000 copies on your own, you might come out ahead than a traditional publishing deal. With a traditional publishing deal, 3,000 copies is definitely not going to earn out your advance. But in indie publishing, I think is the term that the indie publishers like to use, you can do pretty well for yourself. And if the book is more about an overall platform strategy and not sort of an end goal to make money, this could be part of a larger plan, and maybe self-publishing, then you control all these elements. And I think going forward in this year, we're going to have more podcasts on self-publishing, because I think all of us have a lot of questions that we want answered. So, tune in, and we'll definitely, if you have more specific, anybody out there who has specific questions on hybrid publishing, self-publishing, send it to us. And when we have an expert guest on, we can get some of those answered.
That's great.
Something I'll say quickly is the people I know who have done self-publishing and have done it really well often then sold the rights to a publisher. So it was like they did it themselves. And then somebody I know, she did a cookbook or a book last year called The Flower Infused Cocktail. It's gorgeous. And she actually got it into anthropology on her own, which is really cool. Basically, when she was about to do a second print run, a publisher came to her and said, hey, we'd love to publish this. So I think she ended up going that way. So if you want to look her up, she's on Instagram at Wild Folklore.
Well, you mentioned Instagram. I think real advice for this person is to just keep building that platform, whichever way you decide to go. It will help serve.
100%.
Yeah, and you can self-publish and get that funded through your community. Like Kate mentioned, if you've got a newsletter community or something like that, ask them what they're interested in. Think of crowdsourcing information, crowdfunding your project too. Because we crowdfunded Unforgettable. We made the book so that it paid for itself through pre-selling, essentially. And then we sold it to a traditional publisher. We were very lucky. But the thing is that if you're making a community cookbook, for example, that's for your local farms and stuff, my goodness, just focusing on making the most beautiful book for your target audience, and it's small and it's niche, but that's going to be much more powerful, honestly, than going with a corporate traditional publisher.
Agreed.
Well, thank you to the listeners who sent those questions in. We hope to hear from more of you in the future. Before we talk too much about what's ahead for us, let's take a moment to reflect on this past year. We released our first episode back in March, if you can believe it. And now here we are on episode 35. That's a whole lot of cookbook chatter, ladies. Anybody have favorite episodes or takeaways from the past year?
I just feel like I've been doing this for 5 years, in some ways. Like it's gone really fast, but also it feels like, I guess because we've been meeting that long, right?
I have an episode that I keep coming back to because of what's been in the news. And that's the Tori Ritchie episode where Molly and I basically talk to Tori about avoiding happy robot voice, because I don't know if you all have played around with Chat GPT, but it's real. There are robots can write recipes.
Yeah.
So let me just read you. I was playing around with ChatGPT the other day, and I asked it to create a recipe for chicken with a head note. And this is the head note it came up with. This recipe is perfect for those who have never cooked chicken before. The simple seasoning mix adds flavor without overwhelming the delicate flavor of the chicken. Plus, the oven baking method is easy and foolproof, making it a great option for beginner cooks. Give it a try and see for yourself. That was written by AI, people.
That does sound like a happy robot.
That's an SEO perfect head note.
Amazing.
You know?
Amazing.
Oh, man.
It does sound like a happy robot.
Yeah. Voice, what we've been focusing on in the second season here really got me thinking about my own voice. Molly got me thinking and reading a George Saunders book. And it's the one where he walks you through how he teaches people to write short stories. And around page, 90 or something like that, he talks about how we all have different voices that we can pull up to create our writer's voice. And he goes, you've got a lot of them. And the one that you pull up at the moment will be your most energetic voice. And then he goes on to say that energetic voice, you may turn around and you may say, it's not like the best voice, but it's my voice at this time. And I'm kind of standing here alone in what he calls the shit hill. And we can say that on a podcast, right?
Yes, we
and
can.
He's like, but you got to own your voice, your energetic voice for the moment. And you got to just kind of ride with it and see where it takes you. And I think about all the authors that we've had on the show this year as our guests. And we've all kind of are riding that wave, seeing where that hill takes us. And it can change. But for the time, the voice that we've chosen is like that energetic voice that we can bring across to the page, to the reader, to the cook in, relatively facile manner that inspires them to go into the kitchen.
That's very well said.
Yeah.
I love the first, what was it, the 17, we did 1 through 17, just sort of we broke down the nuts and bolts of writing a cookbook. And I just think about that as sort of the spine of this podcast, and that those episodes will always sort of live as a resource because you can go back and visit them at any, whether it's getting a proposal or getting an agent's attention, the editing process, the photography. And I see the arc of those first 17 episodes as, I'll just say it again, like being the sort of the backbone of this podcast. And then the rest kind of colors in and fills in. And so I'm glad we started with those. I think that they stand. And I hope, I know we're going to talk about the future next, but I hope we can do deeper dives into those individual topics as we go forward to get even more insidery.
Yeah, agree. People constantly say that, like, it's an amazing class or, amazing free resource. That's what people keep saying to me. And I've also heard that people who have already published books, they did it differently, which is very cool. But basically about it helps them feel less alone, which that's sort of the point.
That's why we started this whole conversation for me.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we started this podcast because we were lonely writers in our kitchens and at our keyboards, and this little community that we've grown is fun and it's small, it's not gonna, I don't think that we're gonna be Joe Rogan on Spotify.
Brene Brown.
Yeah. But this podcast does take a tremendous amount of resources in terms of time and money. And it's great to know that people find it to be useful. And in fact, there have been people at my publishing house that I work with, and they're like, we're going to tell first-time authors to listen to Everything Cookbooks.
That's great.
And I'm like, great. I need to make some money. We need to make some money off of this.
Yeah. So let's before we go, let's do a quick peek into what we're most excited about. And one of them for me might be, finding a way for this podcast not to cost us quite so much. But Andrea, in 2023, I think we have to start with you because you've got a pretty big project coming.
I do. It's my 7th book. It's called Everything. It's not Everything Cookbooks. It's not called that.
Everything
Vietnamese.
Nope.
Everything Vietnamese. It's called Evergreen Vietnamese. It's, I think, my most creative book that I've written in a very, very long time. It is modern, but it also reaches back to Vietnamese traditions of really, using tons of plants, produce harvested from the earth as well as from the oceans and waters to make wonderful flavors. And it's how I've been eating these days, you guys, for the last few years. Call it my, perimenopause midlife diet that I'm going to continue for the long haul. It's coming out end of April, and I'm so excited about getting it into people's hands and seeing what they do with it. Someday, looking back, I'd love to have a conversation with authors about making books during the pandemic, because I think that they've been made really differently. And in a moment where we were all screaming inside, but yet at the same time, we're tasked ourselves with presenting inspiration and happiness through food. I think that got a lot of us through some very difficult moments in recent years. Making this book was certainly one of those things. And I can't wait till it's like see a little baby out in the world. It's like,
I can't wait to have it in my hands.
Such a perfect
little bird.
Yeah.
So we can pre-order now, right? We can pre-order
Yes.
and we'll get that book in April. It's awesome.
It's such a perfect spring release. I mean, we all know cookbooks come out mostly in the spring and the fall, but to have a evergreen Vietnamese in the spring, I just, gives me hope.
well, thank you. And the title, we talk about titles, and I'll tell you all, is that I came up with evergreen Vietnamese with and I'm normally terrible with titles for anything. But I woke up one day and I had that idea, and I spelled it evergreen like normal, one word. But then my editor, Lorena Jones, says to me, I'll take your title, but how about if we insert a hyphen between ever and green? And I'm like, Lorena Jones, we're being edgy here because we're creating like a new term, because she wanted to underscore the sustainability and the produce aspect. And I was thinking about enduring concepts in Vietnamese cuisine. So it all comes together. So what I want y'all to know is that editors are really important, whether you're, self-publishing or going with a traditional house, because they give you ideas that you never think of.
Allies.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I'm just amazed, Andrea, at your cadence of every 3-ish years a new book. So, man, that's pretty awesome.
Yes.
Yeah, who knows how long I'll keep it up, but so far so good. They let me keep writing.
Well, they let you keep writing and you have the inspiration.
They're fresh, new ideas. Yeah.
Yeah, you have the ideas, the willing to get out in the kitchen. Yeah. And try them out.
It's really impressive.
But Kristin, you're teaching your class.
Yeah, it starts. So I have a class about writing cookbook proposals, and it starts next week, 8 weeks. And I'm going to help aspiring authors or people who are writing books with other creators, food creators, but they're the co-writer. I'm going to help them basically take their proposal from nothing to a fully fleshed out document.
Wonderful.
It's so
I'm
amazing.
excited.
I wish I had you when I wrote
I wish I had
Exactly. I would have paid
Yeah.
that money. I would have paid double to get that information.
Thank you. Yeah. But I did realize I had a very supportive agent who at the time, now I don't know that he would even have time to help somebody with the amount he helped me.
I think
And
it's just going to be such a wonderful resource for people. So
thank you.
And Kate?
Yes. So I think in 2016, I started talking with Shelley Lindgren about an Italian wine book. And the book got kicked around. And this is something that happens sometimes with publishing. You submit a proposal to the editor leaves, it gets lost in the shuffle. You try to figure out if it's still in the house or if it's if it's been lost into the ether. And then we resurrected the idea. I pulled up the contract because I couldn't remember when we signed the deal, but we signed it in March 2019. So everyone knows what happened a year later. But I have to say, it's been a real learning curve for me because it's the first book I've written that has no recipes. It is all a region by region look through Italian wine. To keep it to Andrea's point of this evergreen idea, it really goes into the history of the foundation of the country of Italy to help you understand why each region is so specific and why these traditions they have not only apply to their wine, but also their food. So each chapter ends with sort of a snapshot into the foods of the region as well as the producers, just to give people that sort of what grows together goes together ethos, which is the Italian way of, if this wine was made here, then of course it goes with the radicchio that grows in that field. So it's less about the here and now. These are the best producers. You should only drink their wines. It's more about, let's look at the overall sort of scope of Italian wine, how it fits into the culture and where it fits into at the table. But I have to say, it's the hardest thing I've ever written because, you know, you had to write long essays. Every chapter, 20 chapters of real like prose. And I think I reworked every chapter so many times to make sure I wasn't bored, that I was still interested. And I still doubt it now when I read it. I'm like, is that like, you know what I mean? It's that self-doubt. I'm like, oh, well, now it's too late. Now it has to go out in the world. Yeah. But it was a big learning curve.
When's that book come out, Kate?
It is coming out August 2023. So it's called Italian Wine with Shelley Lindgren and me. If you love season 2 of White Lotus, you might love it because it'll take you into that whole Italy culture.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
There you go. Sponsorship opportunity.
Yeah.
Yeah, like HBO. Hook me up. Molly.
I have not been working on a book, and it's Andrea, you talk about, Kristin, you call it her cadence, that every 3 years. And I sort of go to zero after every book. And after my last book, All About Dinner, came out right before the pandemic, a lot of things changed and I took a big step back. And I also am developing recipes for, decades and decades between all the magazine work and various consulting and various books. And I don't want to say the well is dry, but it is hard for me to develop new recipes. I just don't have as much juice for that right now. And so you mentioned essays, Kate, and this will be the first time I've said this in any sort of public forum, but I really hope to work more on long form nonfiction essay writing because I really miss the writing part of the books that I created. And so I've been thinking a lot about, can I write without including recipes, because that's what I do. And so,
yes,
like I said, I'm getting a little nervous even saying it out loud, but I'm going to attempt to do that. And the recipes may end up coming right back in there. And I wouldn't be surprised if that happens. And one of the things I've learned on this podcast from talking to a lot of our guests are different ways to write recipes. So I'm really interested in playing around with that form. So there, you have it.
That's really cool. I'm glad to hear it.
We're waiting.
Okay.
We're waiting, Molly.
All right.
So,
no pressure.
No pressure. No pressure.
We're going to keep needling you, egging you on.
I did go on record, so.
All right. New Year's resolution.
New Year's hope. Anyway, it's really been wonderful to talk, reflect, and look forward. Anybody have any closing remarks, New Year's wishes, books to recommend, anything you want to say before we sign off and kick off 2023?
I just want to go back to, if you don't find your voice, we've been talking a lot on this podcast about voice. If that confuses you because you're not really sure what your voice is or how your voice is supposed to sound, stay tuned. We do have an episode coming up with Jessie Sheehan, and she talks about how she found her voice. And it's a great look into how, if you keep working at it and you're patient with yourself, it will come out and it might surprise you.
Nice.
Cool. I haven't heard it yet. I'm excited for that.
All right. Well, thanks, everybody. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Thank you for listening to Everything Cookbooks. If you have a comment or question, ping us on our website, everythingcookbooks.com. You can find more episodes of the show at Amazon Music, Apple Podcast, or wherever you listen. And if you like what you hear, please leave a review. Any books mentioned on the show can be found at our affiliate page at bookshop.org. Thanks, as always, to our talented editor, Abby Circatella. And until next time, keep on writing, reading, and cooking.